Hello, dear friends. That's fresh update on Ukrainian battle map situation of Russian-Ukrainian war as of July the 18th. My name is Vasyl Pekhno. I'm a Ukrainian journalist, and I propose to all of you, our dear esteemed English-speaking auditory, to watch this review and understand what is going on Ukrainian battlefield. Looking forward, I'll say that the situation doesn't seem like critical or crucial. But in some points, there are quite tough, I'll say tough regions and tough situations, and I'm going to tell about them. Please join to watching this video with your likes. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave your comments below. Let's begin.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
As usual, we use the deep state resources map application for this. Right away, actually, even jumping ahead a bit, I'll give a general review. Even though there are days when I highlight problems and talk about difficulties, it's really like that in the Pokrovsk area, and it's really like that on the Novopavlivka direction. It's really the same on the front between Kupiansk and Vovchansk. And today, by the way, once again, I'll be talking about these two directions, in essence, the Kharkiv and Donetsk directions, because as expected, and as I mentioned in my map reviews, 2 months ago, the enemy is focusing its main offensive efforts precisely there. And today I will talk about them the most. I hope the review won't be too long, but the main review, the main conclusion, which I'll say in advance, despite the fact that the enemy actually enters settlements at the cost of heavy losses, at the cost of great losses, even on the Novopavlivka direction, there is no easy walk for them. Absolutely nowhere. Even though they are harassing our logistics in Pokrovsk, still for the enemy, there is no easy walk on any section of the front, but the enemy also has no strategic advantage or strategic achievements, neither in the Novopavlivka direction nor in the Kharkiv direction. The only place where they might potentially create a strategic advantage, it's not there yet, but they're moving toward ITIS in Pokrovsk. If the enemy manages to completely cut off our communications in Pokrovsk and achieve success there, but overall, I'll repeat, half the summer has already passed. The Russians have put a lot of effort into this summer offensive campaign, but their achievements are, well, not exactly zero, but objectively not many. Let's take a look at Pokrovsk. Here, as I mentioned, on the Pokrovsk direction, the enemy has actually already approached the settlement of Rudinsky. This is one of our important defensive positions, just like Novokonomichne. In fact, these are two lines of defense that are capable of holding out for a long time. Essentially, this prolonged defense has already begun here. The enemy has practically reached the outskirts of the town of Novokonomichne, just as they have with Rudinsky. Currently, the front line here runs along the river, the Kazani-Toretsk river, which flows through this area. This river winds its way like this from here it is. Shahove, Mayak, Novotoretsk, Razain, Novokonomichne, Bologivka, and up to Khrudivka. In fact, the biggest problem on this section of the front is that the enemy has already managed to reach the other western banks of this river, particularly in the area of the settlement of Razain, and is now advancing through this area toward Rodinska, having already reached its outskirts. In fact, their presence in Rodinska creates problems for Pokrovsk as a whole, as well as for the Milnorad agglomeration. Taking into account that the enemy is also present in half of Novokonomichne, the situation is close to, I don't want to say critical, but it is close to the point where we can talk about imminent fighting for Milnorad from the north and east. And thus Milnorad becomes the gateway to Pokrovsk. In addition, it's important to understand, of course, that there are logistical problems. These problems are serious because Pokrovsk is connected to Milnorad by a single main road. Let's draw it as a thicker line. We'll draw a thinner line for the road that goes through Haishain as well. And the third road goes through Rodinska, then on to Dobropilia. These are the three routes that essentially connect Pokrovsk to the wider world. And we understand that in Rodinska, this route is close to being cut off. At least by drones, both in Hrishain and on the road to Milnorad. Accordingly, the overall structure of the fighting taking place in Donbas is quite unfavorable for the Ukrainian armed forces. And in fact, this is the only direction where the enemy has concentrated, let me remind you. According to the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Syrskyi, 100,000 Russian soldiers here. 100,000 on this section of the front means about 10,000 per 10 kilometers. This is an incredibly high concentration of troops, truly incredible. And to expect that with such a concentration, the enemy would not achieve successful, that was a futile hope. It was a futile hope. Therefore, our further course, as I've said before, is that while losing territory, sometimes retreating, believe me, no one takes any pleasure in retreating, but by giving up territory and inflicting heavy losses on the enemy, we must ensure that they do not achieve their strategic objectives. As of now, this has not happened. In Pokrovsk, the situation is further complicated by the fact that the enemy is also pushing hard in the direction of Odakhne and Kotlin with large forces. It's the same story as before. A large concentration of personnel with various shifts between different directions. So right now, there are three main points around Pokrovsk. Well, let's single them out, okay, into 5 points. 2 in the north Novoekonomichny and Rodinska, 2 in the south Odakhne and Kotlin, and 1 directly facing Pokrovsk, also from the southwest, which is Shevchenko. And between these areas, the enemy maneuvering with these 110,000 troops is essentially striking different points as the situation demands. It's extremely difficult to hold back such force. We do respond, but the offensive initiative still remains with the enemy. On the eastern front, the worst part is not that the enemy is advancing, but that they hold the initiative, and we do not have the ability to seize it for now. In the Sumy region, we managed to seize the initiative. I'll get to that today, but here we cannot take it back. Here, the enemy sets the pace first on the Pokrovsk direction, then at the junction of Milnorad-Pokrovsk, Milnorad-Kostiantinivka, advancing along this road. Then, at some point, the enemy strikes in the Novopavlivka direction, and by constantly shifting the directions of their attacks, they force us to respond. In the end, even the situation in Sumy region was, in a way, a proactive strike by the enemies that we were forced to react. For now, what was good about the Kursk operation? We forced the enemy into a situation where they had to react. Initiative is a very important component of combat operations. I'm not a great professor of military science, but I do understand that when you impose your scenario on the enemy, then you move one step ahead. As of now, we don't have that step ahead movement. At best, we're keeping pace, and keeping pace is not asymmetric action. That's the general trend right now. Things are very difficult for us, and we need to find some way to break the situation. But even despite such unfavorable conditions, the enemy, even having a certain advantage, because in this case a draw or parity is actually an advantage for the opponent, even then, they still don't achieve their objective. But that doesn't mean we won't have to retreat somewhere, for example. In addition, if the situation in the Novopavlivka direction does not change soon, and I see no reason to expect that it will, then in the near future, we will actually see the front line aligning along the Solona River, or rather the Vovcha River. This includes the settlements of Iskra, Ivanivka, Zeleny High, and, by the way, Filia, as well as Novopavlivka. So in the very near future, I fully expect the enemy forces to advance to these specific lines and then consolidate their strategic positions, quite possibly establishing a general and robust defensive line along this significant natural barrier, which will be a considerable challenge. Although it can't be said that the Vovcha River here is such a significant obstacle, Vovcha, Solona, there are actually 3 rivers here, but they aren't really major barriers. But there is every reason to believe that the enemy, having reached the borders of Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions, having entered the Dnipropetrovsk region and having approached Novopavlivka, may take a certain pause after achieving its operational objectives of reaching the borders of Donetsk region, at least in the southern part of Donbass. This too, unfortunately, is a prospect that looks unfavorable for us, but again, it doesn't really change anything in essence. Even if we assume that the front line moves to these positions I was drawing, let's say the front looks like this, even if we imagine that essentially this would at most be a leveling out with further prospects and trends or dangers of pressure building up in the Huliaipo, now Zaporizhia direction. But this is a very, very, very distant prospect. As of now, Pokrovsk and Kostiantinivka are the 2 directions that deserve the most attention. Alongside this, of course, the direction that is emerging not as a secondary, but as a second main one is the Kharkiv direction. I spoke about this much earlier. Not the Zaporizhia or Sumy directions, but the Kharkiv and Pokrovsk directions. These will be the main ones in terms of enemy strike. And now, indeed, after the halfway point, at the climax of this enemy offensive, these are the directions that are truly taking shape as the main one. Because on the Pokrovsk direction, the enemy is creating several points of tension at once, in order to put pressure on the city of Kupiansk and in general on those areas of the Kharkiv region that were occupied in 2022. They are in fact putting pressure on Kupiansk from the north, advancing toward Richna and trying to make progress in Kindrashivka. In addition, another point of tension in recent times has become Vovchansk, particularly the right flank of Vovchansk's defense, the so-called Vovchansk hamlets. Yesterday, I talked about the situation here, mentioning that in some areas it is actually even critical. Yesterday, a public figure, officer, a lieutenant, I believe, of the armed forces with a call sign Alex, he in fact also shared a story about how the 113th Territorial Defense Brigade here is facing very difficult, let's say, circumstances in this defense. I talked about these circumstances as well in yesterday's review, so you can go and check it out. Here, it's gotten to the point where battalion commanders and battalion chiefs of staff are taking part in assault operations and battles. This is not just not okay. It's not even a management crisis. It's a management catastrophe if things like this are happening here. And in fact, we need to understand that this is yet another point of tension. And the third point of tension is in the border area near the settlement of Milo. By the way, it's precisely here that the enemy has recently advanced toward the settlement of Ambarne. Here, towards Ambarne, the enemy has expanded their bridgehead in the border area. In addition, in recent days, they have attempted breakthroughs, just like in Milov, trying to breach the border near Bologivka, close to Stroivka, with the aim of creating what could be called a buffer zone. However, these attempts in Bologivka were unsuccessful. So what we are currently seeing, in fact, with these three hotspots of enemy activity, the main objectives are to hold the bridgehead in the area of the Dvorichna, expand it, and create conditions that would allow equipment to be redeployed across the Oskar River in this direction. The same situation is happening in Vovchansk. Right now, fighting has intensified both in the town of Vovchansk itself and on its flanks, with the enemy aiming to cross the Vovcha River, which currently serves as a kind of dividing line here. And in addition, there are actions along the border. All of this has a single goal: to reach Veliki Burluk, to engage in battles for Veliki Burluk, and then fighting for it will actually serve as an asymmetric way to influence the entire Kupiansk and Kupiansk-Fuzlovi agglomeration. This is the enemy's plan for the upcoming campaign, until the end of summer and the beginning of autumn. Secondly, and I repeat, the main direction of the enemy's offensive alongside Donbass is precisely this Kharkiv agglomeration. Therefore, we can already begin to note that the Veliko Burluk direction is taking shape for it. I think it will be much more active than, for example, the Kherson or Zaporizhia directions. Although I understand that from an informational standpoint, movements toward Zaporizhia or landing near Kherson sound more, well, threatening, more dangerous. However, the real dangers are hidden in other directions. This is the junction of Pokrovsk, Mirnorod, and Kostiantynivka. And this is Veliki Burluk with an advance toward Kupiansk. That's my personal impression based on what's happening here at the front. Because even the Sumy direction, which at one time some consider to be one of the important or perhaps even the main ones, has not become such for now. The commander is pushing the enemy, fully aware of his own problem. At the very least, we can cautiously say here that we have either stopped the enemy in some places or are counterattacking. We are observing a general significant decrease in the intensity of combat operations. In particular, this is true primarily in settlements on the left flank of our defense, such as Kindrativka, especially Kindrativka, because according to my information, the defense forces continue to achieve success there in pushing out enemy troops. And in general, along the Kindrativka-Oleksivka line, as sort of improvised lineage, is now a source of great suffering, specifically for the occupiers, and particularly for their 155th Marine Brigade, which, I remind you, suffered what can be called a decapitating blow to their command 2 weeks ago. Remember, at that time, casualties ranged from the brigade commander to the chief of staff to the brigade's communications officers, and even among the sergeant ranks. Now, obituaries are already coming in regarding the killed sergeants at this location, and even for the deputy commander of the entire Russian Federation Navy. In other words, our missile forces delivered a very serious strike at that time in the settlement of Koryaneve, though you can't see it here. Here it is, Koryaneve. A missile strike was carried out on it, which in turn affects the enemy's ability to conduct offensive actions towards Oleksivka, Kindrativka, and Andriivka itself. So in this direction, the 155th Marine Brigade was operating, and now, after suffering a serious blow to its command, it no longer has the ability to advance, and in some places even finds itself in situations that are close to actual encirclement, not just operational, but actual encirclement of their troops. Accordingly, we can cautiously state that in the Sumy region, the enemy has now been stopped, even by some counterattacks from our troops. As for other directions, there is nothing to add today, except I will remind you once again that we have never, under any circumstances, forgotten about the Siversky district, because in fact, in a phenomenal way here, the front is moving the least. You can see that the Siversky district is the area with the most eastern geographical position among the entire eastern section of the front. In other words, nothing is further east than Siversk among the main strongholds currently defended by our army. Neither Kupiansk, nor Lyman, nor Pokrovsk, nor Konstantinivka, nor even Toretsk are more eastern areas. Only Siversk, it is the easternmost point, and it is, well, the most irritating, I would say, wedge driven into the enemy's lines. A wedge that is close to both Lysychansk and Rubizhne. It is close to an important lateral route that connects Bakhmut through Lysychansk and Rubizhne to Svatov as well. Accordingly, the enemy wants to push the front further from here to the west, to establish it along the line of Slovyansk and Siversk, with access to the gates of Kramatorsk and Slovyansk, accordingly to Lyman and Siversk, or more precisely with access to Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. But in a fantastic way, our defenders in this direction have been doing some incredible superhuman work here for almost 3 years now, holding back the enemy and not allowing the front to move. Ever since we withdrew, remember, that was in 2022, the withdrawal from Severodonetsk, the withdrawal from Lysychansk. Since then, the front here has advanced by the bare minimum, literally by the bare minimum. Moreover, even in recent days, there have been reports that our troops carried out certain counterattacks in the area of Rayhorivka towards Bilohorivka. Kryorivka is still not captured by the enemy, no matter how much they reported about it 2 months ago, as if it had been taken. Verkhnyo-Kamyansky has not been fully captured by the enemy, and Vyimka has not been fully captured by the enemy either. These three settlements, well, okay, Kryorivka might be among the more recent ones, because earlier it was Bilohorivka, but Bilohorivka, after being completely destroyed, was finally occupied by the invaders sometime back in May of this year. But Verkhnyo-Kamyansky and Vyimka, and in general the Siversk section of the front, have been holding out in an incredible way for a very, very long time, even though the enemy has quite serious ambitions for it. So that's the situation on the front overall today, as of the 18th of July, Friday. I'll wrap things up here. Thank you, friends, for your attention. Take care of yourselves. I wish you a peaceful day.